For half a century, the story has been whispered in film circles like a half-buried secret. Lee Van Cleef resented Clint Eastwood, that he felt overshadowed, that there was tension, maybe even bitterness, between the quiet gunslinger and the razor-eyed man who so often played his enemy. But the truth is darker and far more human. When Clint Eastwood arrived in Italy in the early 1960s, he was not yet a legend. He was a television actor from Rawhide, tired of being boxed in, desperate for reinvention. Sergio Leone saw something Hollywood had missed: a stillness, a threat that didn't need dialogue. Lee Van Cleef had already been there, and been discarded. By the time For a Few Dollars More was cast, Van Cleef was considered damaged goods in Hollywood. A devastating car accident had left his knee permanently injured. He walked with pain, rode horses carefully. Directors stopped calling. Villain roles dried up. His career, once promising, had quietly collapsed. Italy didn't see a broken actor. Italy saw danger. Leone insisted on Van Cleef. Studio executives resisted. He was older. He limped. He didn't look safe. Clint Eastwood said nothing, but he didn't object. That silence would later be misunderstood. On set, the contrast between the two men was impossible to ignore. Eastwood was methodical, minimal, almost invisible when the camera stopped rolling. Van Cleef was intense, theatrical, burning with something close to desperation. Not ego, urgency. He knew this might be his last chance. Rumors grew quickly. Crew members noticed the distance. No laughter between takes. No bonding. Just professionalism edged with tension. But here's what Lee Van Cleef later admitted in private conversations. The tension wasn't between them. It was inside him. Clint Eastwood represented everything Van Cleef feared he had lost: momentum, youth, the future. And every time the camera lingered on Clint's cold stare, it reminded Lee how close he had come to disappearing forever. Still, Van Cleef never asked for sympathy. He played his role harder, sharper, more dangerous. He turned villains into icons. What audiences didn't realize was this: Leone didn't pit them against each other. He paired them as equals. And that decision would change everything. When For a Few Dollars More exploded across Europe and then the world, the headlines focused on one name: Clint Eastwood. He was young, new, a face audiences hadn't grown tired of yet. The camera loved his restraint, the way he said nothing and let violence speak for him. But quietly, something else was happening. Lee Van Cleef was being resurrected. After years of rejection in Hollywood, his sharp features and controlled menace suddenly felt timeless. Directors no longer saw a broken actor with a damaged leg. They saw authority. They saw danger. They saw depth. Sergio Leone saw it most clearly and trusted him again. That trust changed Van Cleef's fate. Yet behind the scenes, rumors began to grow. Crew members noticed the distance between Eastwood and Van Cleef. No jokes, no shared meals, no friendship, just work. Then silence. To outsiders, it looked like contempt. To Van Cleef, at first, it felt personal. He had waited years for another chance, only to find himself standing next to a man whose career was accelerating effortlessly. Clint Eastwood barely spoke on set. He stayed focused, detached, almost sealed off from everyone around him. In an industry built on charm and connection, that kind of quiet felt threatening. Van Cleef later admitted there were moments he misread it. He thought Eastwood's distance meant dismissal, that the rising star didn't see him as an equal, that he was being tolerated, not respected. But the truth was more complicated and far less cruel. Clint Eastwood wasn't cold. He was cautious. He had seen Hollywood chew people up and discard them without warning. He didn't trust closeness. He didn't trust promises. He believed survival meant control over his image, his work, and his emotions. Silence wasn't arrogance, it was armor. And importantly, Clint never tried to diminish Lee Van Cleef. In fact, when studio voices suggested softening Van Cleef's character, Eastwood didn't support it. The film needed Van Cleef strong, dangerous, equal. Without that balance, Clint's own mystique wouldn't work. Van Cleef slowly realized something painful but clarifying. Clint Eastwood wasn't competing with him. He was running from the same fear, irrelevance. The difference was timing. Eastwood was running forward. Van Cleef was running back from the edge. As the good, the bad, and the ugly followed, Van Cleef's presence became iconic. Audiences didn't just fear him, they admired him. He wasn't a disposable villain. He was a force. And that status existed because the films treated him seriously. Years later, when asked why he and Clint were never close, Van Cleef's answer surprised many. He didn't owe me friendship. He gave me respect. That was the silence people misunderstood. Not hostility, not jealousy, but two men guarding themselves in different ways. One by withdrawing, the other by burning intensely in every frame he was given. And perhaps the most tragic truth of all was this. By the time Van Cleef fully understood Eastwood's distance, there was no time left to change the story people had already written for them. Sometimes, silence isn't the absence of feeling. It's the cost of staying alive in a world that forgets you the moment you slow down. Lee Van Cleef didn't live long enough to see Clint Eastwood become an institution, a director, an Oscar winner, a symbol of American masculinity reinvented. But he understood the path. In his final years, Van Cleef spoke less about rivalry and more about survival, about how legends are often lonely, about how silence can be mistaken for cruelty, and about how pain, physical and emotional, shapes performance more than talent ever could. He acknowledged something few expected. Without Clint Eastwood, his career revival might never have happened. Without Lee Van Cleef, Clint's myth might have lacked its edge. They were never friends. They were never enemies. They were two men passing through the same storm at different stages of life. And perhaps that's the final truth Lee Van Cleef left behind. Hollywood doesn't reward honesty. It rewards endurance. Eastwood endured by withdrawing. Van Cleef endured by burning brighter. Both paid a price. Cinema remembers gunfights and close-ups, but rarely the quiet choices behind them. And sometimes, the truth isn't about conflict at all, but about two men doing whatever it took not to disappear.